Hi, everybody. I'm Ben Mankiewicz. Our TCM Spotlight series this month focuses on the films of 5 directors who served during World War II, and tonight we're featuring the movies of William Wyler. Back with me is my guest, Mark Harris, whose book, 5 Came Back, details the wartime experiences and films of Frank Capra, John Ford, John Huston, George Stevens, and Wyler. Mark, welcome back.
Thanks, Ben. It's good to be here.
Up next, a documentary co-directed by William Wyler and John Sturges, produced by the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1947. It's Thunderbolt. Now, the date there matters a lot to this movie, 1947. Why was this released in 1947?
Right, it doesn't sound right for a World War II documentary, but it was released in 1947 because when Wyler was shooting footage for it, not in a combat situation, but just actually gathering extra footage of the sort of bombed and ruined Italian coastline, he was in a plane, which, like all of these planes, was, unpressurized and incredibly noisy. And when the plane landed, he stumbled out of the plane, had no balance at all, and had lost all of his hearing. And at first, he and his doctors assumed that it was just a temporary thing, but when his hearing didn't come back the next day, literally overnight, his Army career was over, and he thought his filmmaking career was over. He had gone from Army officer in charge of making films about the air war to disabled veteran.
But a couple of years later, he finishes this film, which is a compelling story about smaller bombers used in the battle for Italy, with these bombing raids where they essentially planned to blow up every bridge in Italy and railroad to cut off the Nazis' supply lines and allow the Allies to advance north through Italy.
Right. I mean, this was in some ways supposed to be a sequel to the Memphis Belle. It was like you made one great movie about an amazing piece of equipment, now make another. But, of course, by the time the war ended, there was really no need for a movie like Thunderbolt. It was a love letter to a plane that was designed to fight in battles that were no longer being fought. And even though Wyler's reputation was sterling, and he had won an Oscar for Mrs. Miniver, was about to go on to win another Oscar for The Best Years of Our Lives, it wasn't enough to convince anyone to give this more than the most marginal token release.
It strikes me as amazing that this guy who had won the Oscar for Mrs. Miniver, this first great piece of war propaganda that everybody loved, and Wyler was the toast of the town, even though he was in London and couldn't celebrate being the toast of the town, can't get anybody to release his movie 4 years later. And the reason that he'd been away for 4 years is because he'd been serving his country.
Right. I mean, I think Wyler was realistic. I don't think he thought it was the greatest movie he had ever made or the most important cinematic achievement of the war, but I do think he felt that he had given more to this movie, certainly than he ever anticipated giving. You know, this movie had cost him his hearing. He got a little bit of hearing back in 1 year, but it's really fair to say it nearly cost him his career. I think it just would have been too painful for him to have it all be for a movie that was never even shown.
All right, Mark. Thanks very much. Here is the movie from 1947 with an introduction by Jimmy Stewart and with Lloyd Bridges as the voice of the pilot. It's Thunderbolt.